Okay, time to start this week's programming club meeting. So I'm Aaron. We're doing JavaScript this week. It's going to be multi-part JavaScript built into a multi-part web development tutorial. Oh, that's not supposed to happen. I'm not just do this. Okay, anyways. First things first, if you didn't already hear, go to the website, /questions. You'll get logged into attendance, and I can see questions. So, yeah, we're gonna. I have to find my screen share. Also, now that we're actually starting, man, this is a great start. We have our DigiKey teams selected, so this will be Team 1. I'm not going to say any names because I probably won't pronounce them right, and everybody here can read. So there's Team 1, and then we have Team 2 here. So that's just, those are the DigiKey teams. That's October 16th for those of you involved, and we'll send out, I think, Slack messages and get it organized and everything. But without further ado, so what is JavaScript? JavaScript is the language, one of the languages used so that your website of HTML and CSS can actually do things, because HTML provides the framework, so it adds paragraphs and titles and lists and tables and all of that stuff. And then CSS adds all of your styling so it doesn't look super ugly. JavaScript is one way you can use it so that you can get form input or change colors spontaneously at the click of a button, just a bunch of stuff like that. It's an interpreted language, so like C, when you want to run your C program, you will, you'll do GCC, name of your program, and you'll compile it down into an executable, and then you run your executable. JavaScript is interpreted as you go, so instead of needing to compile it and wait, it just goes whenever things happen, which is perfect for a web setting because then it doesn't need to compile. And it's loosely typed, which C and C++ and stuff like that would be a language I'm going to say hardly typed, but that's not what it's called, where when you declare a variable, you say specifically that it is an integer or a string or a character, and then it doesn't change or anything like that. JavaScript, you aren't that specific when you are declaring your variable, and then, as we'll get to later, variables can change type as the program moves on. So syntax, it's fairly similar to C. So everything, the way you do things in C, probably how you do it here. But differences, there's not like a main function, so you don't do int main and have it run. The whole thing is basically the main function, and it just runs as soon as it's loaded in and the web page starts. Also, there's not like a global space. That might be my next bullet, but everything operates in the global space. My bad. So when you declare a variable above a function, I'm pretty sure this is right. In the function, you can just use that variable because they're all global, so it's in that kind of order. And then variables, if you just type I = 0 in your for loop without declaring it first, it works just fine. Sometimes that can get annoying, but you can, at the very top of your JavaScript file, add in quotation marks, use space strict, all lowercase, and then it kind of gets rid of some of that, so it's easier to work with for people who are more familiar with that, but it doesn't negate any functionality. So this basic C program, all it does is it loops through this array and then prints if that is an even or an odd number. So then that's how it works in C. So then JavaScript, this is how we would do it in JavaScript based off of that C program. There are a few key differences. Notice here, instead of saying int number equals 10, we say const number equals 10. This represents the number, it's not going to change, it's a constant. Then for this array, we said let instead of int array, saying it'll be an array of integers. And then to initialize it, instead of equaling it and then the curly brackets, we use square braces and put whatever you want to put inside of your array in there. And when you're declaring your array, you didn't need to put square brackets right behind array. That was all fine. We haven't declared I yet. I just put it in there. It'll work fine. And then I used array.length here. You could have also put number here because number is technically the size of the array right now, but it would work. And then instead of our printfs, we have our console.log. This only in, it won't declare, or not declare, print out to the user specifically. Browsers have the console and the web inspector and stuff. This is where all of those messages will go. It's way easier to use this for debugging than trying to print HTML to the screen, because it's more work than needed to just figure out how your program is working. So that's what you would be doing these console.logs for. So obviously you use JavaScript with websites, and there are a few ways you include this into your HTML file. You can either use a script tag, so you would, like every other tag, like a p or a list, you would do the angle brackets script, and then it would open up a section that you can type all of your JavaScript into, and it'll do that. You can also external code from a content delivery network. This is how you would use like big library like jQuery. If you don't download it and then put it into your folders, it pulls from the internet and then gets the code that way. You put that also in a script tag, and then one of the attributes you'll use, I don't have any demos of this, I was going to. You'll put source equals, usually they provide like a link, you just copy and paste a script tag into your website and all is fine and dandy. And then you can also put it in an external JavaScript file. This works best when you're going to have just a bunch of JavaScript. It won't clutter up your HTML file. And then all of this, best practice is to put it at the bottom of your HTML file. This way the website can load in and not have to wait for JavaScript to start doing all of its stuff before content appears on the screen. It usually isn't that big of a delay, but I mean, it's better this way. So variables. As I mentioned earlier, variable type can change. Sometimes this can be useful, sometimes this isn't very useful, but it can happen. So you can declare a string as a variable, use it for a little bit, and then if you don't need it anymore, instead of declaring a new variable, you can recycle it and turn it into like a Boolean or something if it fit in your program. So we have two main ways we declare variables in JavaScript, which I also kind of mentioned earlier. We have let. This is what you use when your variable will change its value. So if you're going to be assigning it like 5 and then 7 and then 15, it would be a let variable. So you would just do let variable name equals thing or not equals. You don't have to initialize it right away. Const, this is a constant. Similar kind of to defining a constant in C. You do have to initialize it because otherwise it doesn't have a value, and then these ones won't ever change. So this can be useful, like if you know how big the size of an array will be, you would declare it as a constant, and then you're not taking up as many resources for the extra like thousands of characters or digits that this number could be if it's only going to be 6. You'll also see around the web var. This is how it used to be done. Just everything was a var. But then I think it was in 2015 they released ES6, which is like their version of JavaScript. So it's not typically used anymore. Best practice would be to use let and const. But you'll see it around. It'll kind of work. It will work fine, but just keep that in mind. So JavaScript types. I mentioned JavaScript is a loosely typed language. This would mean that you don't have variables aren't specific to their types. You don't give it a type right away when you initialize it. It just kind of like goes with the flow, kind of. It has normal types, and it has a number type, which is basically an int and a float at the same time. It's just a number. They're not separated. It has string, character, Boolean, objects, stuff like that. Variable type can change from string to Boolean to number, date. And then if you ever need to get the type of your variable, this can be useful either in a like actual programming sense. Sometimes you'll do something different based off of if your variable is a string or a Boolean, say. It's also very useful in debugging because of the loose typeness of JavaScript. Sometimes you won't know if a variable is properly being assigned. So you can type of, and it'll let you know if it is in fact a number or if it's a string, because numbers and strings that have just numbers in them can get kind of confusing in JavaScript. So type of can help that. And then lots of this stuff with types is resolved. There's another language. It's basically JavaScript. It's called TypeScript. And in this, you can declare all variables have types. So it's a lot more like an explicitly typed language like C or C++, where everything has a type. It can't just change willy-nilly. It'll be how you expect it the whole time. So that's how that will all work. So here, simple example. I declare variable equals 10, so it's a number type. And then variable equals greetings, it's a string there. And then set it to a Boolean, it's false. And then that's an example of how you would do type of your variable. Functions. So those 150 folks, you won't have covered these yet. But functions are basically a way to take a part of your program that you'll do a lot of times, and you can take it away from your main function in C, declare it up at the top, and then you can just pass in parameters. It'll do work. It makes your code cleaner and a lot of times way easier, so you don't have to like copy and paste the same block of code 9 times whenever you need to like loop through your array to print it. You can just make a printing array function. It'll print it. So this is how it works in JavaScript. There's no declared return type. So you just type function, the name of your function, any parameters in parentheses, and then brackets, type all your code in it, and then you can return from it. So there's that. And then notice how I have min equals 0 there. So what this can do is it makes min an optional parameter. So if I don't want to pass in min, it defaults to 0 and the program will work just fine. But I can also send it a value and it'll know, it'll put in the value I passed and it'll work with that value instead. Here are your returning sum. If it could return anything, some could change types along the way. Since there is no return type, you don't have to put a return, or you can, it won't get mad at you. It'll work just fine. And then here is calling my function. So sum equals the summation of the array. This will sum up the array. Everything in it greater than or equal to 0, it'll sum it up and return that sum. So in the bottom one, when I set my min to 5, it checks that if anything that's less than 5 does not get added to the sum. So in this case, it would only be 12 instead of 20. Just an example. I don't really see how this would be like a useful program in real life, but like, hey, it could be. And a reminder, you guys can ask questions. I feel like I'm just blaring through this. Arrays, mentioned those a couple times. They're ways, you store data. In JavaScript, there isn't a hard size limit to your array. In C, we have to declare that this array is going to have 5 elements in it. In JavaScript, you don't do that. You can just put in as many as you want to start with, and then you can add or delete them as you go along. It can be super useful. It's sort of similar to like vectors in C++, but it comes in handy. You don't have to mess with dynamically sizing your array, because that can sometimes get a bit messy in C. So it's a pretty nice way of dealing with things. They also, going along with JavaScript's theme of not being very typed, it can hold as many types as you want. So you could declare an array with like a bunch of numbers and then a bunch of strings and then some booleans and then some objects, and it would just work fine. And then you would have to obviously utilize how different that was working, but in your program. You'd have to not just be able to loop through it and add numbers, because that wouldn't work. And then you can use methods on these arrays to do very common monotonous tasks that would be hard to program into your own program and make yours more bulky. So they're just built right into JavaScript. And I have a few examples here on this slide, but there's way more than this. You can find them on the internet. I know W3 Schools is a good one, and then Mozilla's development docs are also a good one, just to familiarize yourself with what are methods in JavaScript, so you don't go along making your own method to like sort an array, for example, and then find out that you could have just put in a method in like 3 lines of code. So there's 2 different ways to declare an empty array. You can either just do square brackets like that, or a new array object is basically how that's working. I don't think there's a benefit to doing it either way, but you can do it whichever works better for your program or your syntactic style. So here I'm initializing the array, again, without curly braces, using the square brackets. And then we get down here now into using some different methods. This method, the for each method, it will help you so that you can go through every single thing in the array and do something with it. Here I have declared a function within this method to do something. It's just a short little, 3 lines. You could also just put inside of that method the name of your function, pass in your parameters. If you had like a really long function that you needed to run there, then it would make this part of your code cleaner. So you could abstract that away, put that up top, and do it like that. So what I'm doing here is if E is less than 10, E represents the element at that point in the array. So as it loops through the array, E is the certain one I am looking at. What I'm doing is calling the splice function, which will remove that element from the array. So array.indexOf gets the index of E. So if you knew the index, you would just type like 3 or 4 there or whatever. And then the 1 is telling me how many elements I'm going to delete from that point. So then we move on to sorting this array. So the JavaScript sort function does not work exactly like how you would think it would. Like, you'd think you do array.sort just like this, boom, sorts your list of numbers. But it's actually optimized towards arrays of strings. So if it sorts a list of numbers, by default, what it will do is sort them kind of like that. So with that happening, that means like 10,000 would be greater than 100. So it would put that one in the wrong order. So it can really mess up a numbered array if you do sort on it without doing anything, which is why here we are declaring this function. What this is doing is it's passing a different way that sort is supposed to sort these things. So I'm giving it A and B, which are the element I'm at and the next element, and then it returns A minus B. So in this case, A is the one I'm at, B is the next one. It returns A minus B. So if the one I'm at minus the next one is a positive number, that means A is bigger than B, so it will flip those. But if it's a negative number, that means A is smaller than B, so it will stay in the same place it's at. There are other ways you can obviously use this methodology. If I did B minus A, it would sort it in the other order. You could add other functions completely. Again, you can use docs online to find examples of other ways you can sort. Another useful method, this one, the mapping function, is similar to for each, as in it loops through every single element in the array. But what it does is returns a new value to be stored in that element. So this one, I'm squaring every single number inside of this array. So instead of needing to like do a regular for loop, it would work like this. You can use this to do all sorts of things, so it can be very useful. I know we used it in our website a couple of times because you just need to sometimes, it can mass go through elements and change types of objects if needed, stuff like that. And then you can also remove and add elements from the front and back. So push and pop work with the back of the array. So pushing, I'm adding 144 into this array. And then popping, I'm removing 144 from that array. You can either do it like this, or I'm letting my variable back equal the whatever is popped off. So array.pop returns 144. But if I have no use for that in my program, I'm just deleting the thing at the back. I can just call array.pop. It'll remove the last thing, and that value will just go away, and I don't need it. Similarly, unshift and shift work with the front of the array. So unshift, I am adding 64 to the beginning of the array. And then shift, I am removing 64. And same thing here. I can either store 64 into a new variable, or I can remove it. Or I can remove it, and it just won't be used in my program further. It doesn't matter, whatever you need to use. And then I think the last thing I have is objects. These obviously covered in an object-oriented standpoint, but what objects can be utilized for is defining one thing that has a bunch of like related things. They're like structures kind of in C. So I can have my object of people and then or a person, and it'll store like their name and their age and all of that stuff in one easy to use container instead of needing to have like a bunch of regular independent variables that just clutter up a program and make it unnecessary. I guess I already said all this. And then also with JavaScript, you can take objects and store them in a JSON file. So it provides an easy to work with format that can be easily written to a file and stored in a file. Like VS Code, all of its settings are stored in a JSON file so that you can change those as you want. It's much better than, and so then it's easier to work with too than like writing binary out in C, because then you'll have to like switch it all back to regular and use it. This you would just read in your file. You call like the JSON parsify or something like that method, and it just makes an object for you that you can work with in your code. So here I have a fairly simple example. I have a person. First name is John, last name is Smith, age. So notice everything, I have different types here. So you don't have to store only strings, you can store whatever types you want. Those can obviously change, as we've learned with JavaScript. And then, so to work with these things, you would use the dot like this. So person dot property, and then you can set it or read it like that. So here I'm setting person to true. So then having one object is good, but a very useful thing is an array of objects. So I can declare my array and fill it with objects. And notice how each of these objects is different. One of them just has name and age. The other one has name, age, and a Boolean value. And then the other one has name, age, and a separate number value. This is very legal. It can be useful too. Sometimes you'll just have objects that they're special. They need an extra thing. Usually you'll just store all of these things. But if you need it, it's possible. And then here I'm accessing my array like I would normally access my array. And then, so I'm people, the second one, that would be zero-based indexing. So index 2 would be Bridget. Bridget.name is Bridget. So here it would console.log Bridget to the screen and work just like that. So if anybody has any questions, so right now, you could easily just go plop open a JavaScript file, start typing it in. Except then, the only ways you would be able to run it is using an HTML file and setting up and just opening like that. But you could also use Node.js, which is a server framework built with JavaScript. So you could also run a JavaScript file as if it were like an executable that you would get from your C file. You would install Node, and then in your command line, at least in Linux, how this works is you would just do node name of your JavaScript file, and it would run that file. So I guess you could do that. Next week will not be JavaScript part 2. That will be coming eventually. I don't know when. We aren't that far planned out yet. But there will be a JavaScript part 2. I believe then we'll eventually reference PHP, and eventually will culminate in React, probably. So, any questions? Assuming this questions page is working like I think it will. Or if you just have one in Discord, assuming I can still hear the Discord. I'll take that as a no. Next week, I believe we are planning on doing a more fun idea, like similar to how last year when they played Jeopardy. We haven't fleshed out all the details, but it will probably be something along those lines. Other than that, I guess we can all go eat supper or something. The meeting is now concluded.